Let's welcome Scott.
All right, thank you very much. It's really great to be here. I have had the opportunity to do the men's breakfast the last few years, and it's been really great. So when Paul and Nick asked me to do Man Camp, it was sort of a no-brainer. I thought I'd love to do it. And so I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to talk about the topic of transformation. And I've chosen 3 topics which I think are really central to that in our transformation as individuals, and so that we can be much more effective for God. So I want to start tonight with the topic of the transforming power of acceptance, which is how to stop picking a fight with God's reality, which we can very easily fall into. And I was thinking earlier with what Nick said as well about transparency and, that none of us are perfect and all that sort of thing. And I've had this realization with a lot of the stuff that I'm really passionate about teaching. And it's this statement that you teach what you most need to learn. And that certainly is my story, that the stuff that I've found myself most passionate about is stuff that's been most impactful in my life and continues to be. And acceptance is a really big one of them. So I want to give you 2 truths to start with that may not mean a lot to you at the start, but by the end of this talk, I guarantee you it's going to make a lot of sense to you. And the first is that your lack of acceptance, if it is happening in your life, is dramatically impairing your ability to learn, grow, and adapt. That's 100% true. And the second thing is, if you're feeling really stuck in your life, there is a very good chance that non-acceptance is at play. I have a saying that everything pivots on acceptance, and I've found almost every time if somebody's feeling incredibly emotionally stuck, it's usually because on some level they're in a profound sense of resistance against something that they need to let go of or to accept. So just wanted to start with those 2 points, but that'll make a lot more sense by the time we're finished tonight. So let's think about what it is that we struggle to accept in life, because I think we all hit things that we really struggle to accept. Life gives us things that are pretty unpleasant. So, for example, it could be a loss, something that's been taken from us. It could be, things that have happened to us in our past that we really struggle to accept. It can be previous choices that we've made that we now regret and play over in our mind and wish were not so. It could be some of the people in our life, family members, our partner, that we really struggle to accept who and what they are. It could be our employment status, what's happening in our work life. It could be an injustice. That's a really common one that we can get into non-acceptance around, because things can be incredibly unfair. And I'm making an assumption that a number of you in this room have suffered significant injustices. Certainly it can be thwarted desires, dreams, expectations, or aspirations. Life's just not going the way that we wanted or expected. It could be the state of our body or our health, that we're in chronic pain or we have an illness that we never would have wished upon ourselves. It could be things that are just outside of our control. So, the government, the economy, culture, society, there's plenty of fodder there, things that are not necessarily to our liking. And then finally, it could just be ourselves. We just don't like who we are, how we're wired, our personality, whatever it is. And certainly Paul will talk more to that last one tomorrow about acceptance of self. But we've all got something, right? I mean, just hands up, who's got something somewhere on that list? Yep, well, we're in good company. Excellent. So this face here, I teach a lot about acceptance in my job, and that's the face I often get when I come and introduce the topic. And so the way I introduce it now is I say to people, look, I'm going to talk about acceptance, and you're probably going to think that I'm trying to make you eat dog poop, right? Because that's honestly what some people feel like. Like, why should I accept stuff? It's not right. And all I would say is that, just like I say to the people that I teach it to at the hospital, is that I want you to open your mind, because acceptance is one of the greatest kindnesses that you can do for yourself. It's not eating dog poop. It actually can set you free in ways that you may not even realize yet. So just encourage you, if you feel skeptical, that's okay, but just try and keep an open mind. Because as we come to acceptance, we hit what I call the but. And I'm just going to read this, that many people immediately balk at the idea of acceptance because they have a deeply mistaken view of what it actually means. So I want to be very clear from the outset so that we're not confused around this issue. First of all, acceptance does not mean that we emotionally like, approve of, or agree with something. Right? Something that is really yuck. It doesn't mean like we're saying, oh yay, I'm so glad this is in my life. Right? It's not like that. Acceptance also does not mean that you stop desiring things to be a certain way in your life. It's okay to have preferences and expectations of what we would like, but it's just with acceptance we learn to let go of it having to be a particular way in order for us to be okay or for us to be in good relationship with God. Because when things are not the way we would prefer and we can't accept it, then we're not okay, and we often get into real loggerheads with God as well, as in, how could you have let this happen to me? And the final thing is, acceptance does not mean that we passively resign ourselves to something unpleasant. I think that's a lot of people's fear as well, as it's like, oh, I have to accept it, I'm just kind of abandoning myself to it or resigning myself to it. What you'll actually find is that acceptance is an extremely active process. Right? Acceptance enables us to begin to pivot and take constructive and positive action. Right? So it's not resignation, it's a very different thing. So I just want to say that from the outset to try and disarm in a way any sort of mental protests that may be coming up in your mind. So what is acceptance? It is to acknowledge reality as it is, as opposed to how we would prefer it to be. And it is to adapt to life on God's terms rather than the terms that we would prefer. And it means that we become willing to let go of the fruitless protest that things cannot, should not, and must not be the way they are when they clearly are that way. Right? So you'll probably hear me say that phrase, cannot, should not, must not, a few times in this presentation. Because that is the heart of non-acceptance. That something's happening and in our minds we're going, this cannot, should not, must not be this way, when it is that way. Yeah? So that's the heart of non-acceptance. And acceptance is the only really workable attitude in the face of unpleasant people, situations, or conditions that we cannot realistically change. So it's the only thing that actually works. Right? When we're in non-acceptance and we hit things that we can't change, we then amplify our suffering in an incredible way. So I love this here. What is acceptance? This is actually given to me by a colleague. It's just a simple way of saying it. So on the left-hand side, you've got non-acceptance. It's raining. I'm going to have to read it off this screen because it's too small up there. I don't like rain. I wish it wasn't raining. My day would be better if it wasn't raining. My day is ruined. Every day is like this. It's always like this. Why does it always rain when all I want it to be, for it to be, is sunny? Right? And on the right, it's raining. Yep. Who do you think is going to have a better day? Right? The people on the right. Because once there is acceptance and we drop the protest, our energy is then freed up to think about how you want to spend your day. Put the raincoat on, the umbrella, what am I going to do inside, whatever it happens to be. Right? So acceptance opens the door to adaptation, right, in a healthy way. So when we're talking about acceptance struggles, I love this term. It actually comes from an Australian psychologist called Russ Harris, who's done a lot of great work. And he talks about this thing called reality gaps. And so a reality gap is the top line you can see there, that blue line, is your expectation, my expectation. Right? We have a vision for how we expect life to be, how we expect others to treat us, how we expect our jobs to be going, how we expect our finance to be going, our health. So we have a vision, and that's shaped by many different forces. Our innate personality, the cultural influences, what we've been taught as a child, but we have expectations. And then reality comes along. Right? And that's that bottom line where reality serves up something that is much less than what we expected. And that's what we call the reality gap. Now, none of us escapes this, right? We all know that we have reality gaps in our life, and it is normal and healthy to have painful emotions around that. I'll talk more to that in a moment. But we can get ourselves very trapped when non-acceptance begins to play out in unhealthy ways in our reality gaps. Now, in saying all of that, the first thing we need to consider when we have a reality gap is the question of, should I just accept it or should I change it? In other words, and I think this is the important point, if you can take reasonable and responsible action to close a reality gap, and what I mean by that is to change your reality to match your expectations, then by all means do it. As long as it's, scriptural and it's within biblical bounds, I think we can take responsible action to close reality gaps. So I'll give you some examples here. If your partner, your child, or a colleague is treating you disrespectfully, then you are well within your rights to confront them, to speak up assertively, and to inform them of how you would prefer to be related to. That's okay. If you are unfairly dismissed from a job you love, you should go through the appropriate channels to hold the employer to account and to have your job reinstated or some sort of compensation. That's okay. If you don't have sufficient money to, sorry, I'm going to have to read this up here, to pay your bills or to sustain the lifestyle you desire, you should attempt steps to either budget more wisely or to seek opportunities to raise your level of income. That's okay. And finally, let's go back. If you're struggling with a chronic pain condition and there are medications, psychological skills, physical exercises that can help you to manage or ameliorate that condition, then try them out. All right? So you don't just resign yourself to those situations and call that acceptance. All right? That's resignation. But here's the rub. What if, no matter what you do, that person does not respect you, you cannot get that job back or compensated in an appropriate way, you cannot seem to get your finances to work, and that chronic pain condition just won't go away no matter what you do, right? Then it's a different story, right? This is where acceptance comes into play. And if it doesn't, our suffering amplifies exponentially. So we need to discern the season, I think is the point here. And I'm not going to read through all of this, but you know the verses in Ecclesiastes, a time for this, a time for that, a time for this, a time for that. In other words, it's not only one thing or the other. Sometimes it's that, sometimes it's this, right? And it's learning how to discern what season it is. And we can say it's the same with acceptance. Sometimes it's a time to change it and to put effort into that. And other times it's a time to accept it, whatever it is. And there's a lovely quote by Shanthi Sekaran. She's an author, I believe. She says, sometimes the things that happen can be changed. Sometimes they cannot. What time is this? Which time is this? So it's asking us to be discerning around what time it is. Because if we try to change something that can't be changed, we will end up in all sorts of suffering and mental affliction, mental emotional affliction. But if we don't try to change something that actually could be changed through our responsible efforts, we are not being responsible for our lives. Right, so it's discernment, discernment, discernment. But let's go for the situations that no matter what we do, they are what they are. All right? And so I call this the distressing person, situation, or condition. Because whatever that thing is, it's usually in the form of a person, a situation, or a condition in our lives. And what you'll notice, if you follow the picture down, is that pain is the first thing that comes with that. So that may be grief or sadness if it's to do with loss, frustration or anger if it's unfair or unjust, or fear and uncertainty if we're not sure where things are going to go because of this issue. And those emotions are perfectly normal and natural. right? So for instance, if to use a physical example, if something cuts my leg and I go, ow, does that mean something's wrong with me, that I feel pain? No, it means my body is operating as it should to let me know something's wrong. It's the same in our emotional system, right? When we have distressing people, situations and conditions, we feel pain, right? And nobody should tell you that you should not feel that, right? And invalidate those emotions. We need places and spaces in our life where we can bring that, right? And if you look at the book of Psalms, I mean, so much of that is an expression of those types of emotions in the face of unpleasant situations. So it's okay. It's okay to feel that. But problems really amplify and suffering amplifies if we go down the path of non-acceptance, which is that left-hand side, is that if we begin to rigidly protest against the person's situation or condition, then the grief and sadness morphs into self-pitying rumination, right? So rumination is where we just go over and 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 over. And we begin to over-identify and self-cannibalize, if you want to call it that, through self-pity. The normal frustration and anger begins to morph into rage, bitterness, and resentment. So we become very resentful. And I love that statement that resentment is drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. Some of you have probably heard that before, that it really harms us. Or an even more graphic way of putting it I heard this year is that resentment is setting yourself on fire and hoping the other person chokes on the smoke. All right? Is that once we go into that state, we're in trouble. We're in suffering. You know, and the last one is overwhelming anxiety. When we hit non-acceptance and we're in the cannot, should not, must not, it stirs up incredible anxiety in our nervous system as well. And so that leads to the bottom line there, suffering and stuckness. What you'll notice on the right-hand side is when we practice acceptance around the distressing person, situation, or condition, we're just left with the pure emotion, right? The grief and sadness, the frustration and anger, the fear and uncertainty may still be there, but it's not necessarily overwhelming and all-consuming. So it opens up the possibility that we can continue to adapt, to learn from the situation, or even to grow. Right? So acceptance opens up those possibilities, whereas non-acceptance blocks it. So let's point, I want to give you sort of the full picture of what happens. That non-acceptance unfortunately leads to what I call the kissing cousins, self-pity and resentment. Right? So non-acceptance leads to self-pity and resentment, which is actually something we call victim mentality. Which nobody wants to admit that they're in, right? But victim mentality is where that thing, whatever it is now dictating our emotional lives. We've become a victim to it. And it's a really yucky place to be. But non-acceptance will always lead us to that, which is why a lady called Byron Katie says, when you argue with reality, you lose, but only 100% of the time. And that's true. Right? Because you can't fight with God's reality, what's actually playing out. So shining a light on the self-pity component instead of the resentment component. Self-pity is, if you look at the dictionary definition, it says a self-indulgent dwelling on one's own sorrows or misfortunes, or excessive self-absorbed unhappiness over one's own troubles. Has anyone fallen into the pit of self-pity? Right. Many times. It is a seductive pit. It feels justified, all right? But we know that self-pity in the end is self-cannibalizing. It actually chews us up, drives other people away, and doesn't fix anything, all right? It doesn't fix anything. I love this. This is a quote from a lady called Amy Morin, who wrote a book called 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do. And she wrote this book on the back of 3 really significant losses. Her husband died, her mother died, and somebody else died in her life, and just a lot of tragedies. And one of the chapters in that book is called Mentally Strong People Don't Engage in Self-Pity. And I love this quote. It's really powerful. She says, although sadness is a normal, healthy emotion. Dwelling on your sorrow and misfortunes is self-destructive. So that's self-pity when we're beginning to really dwell. Self-pity gets in the way of dealing with grief, sadness, anger, and other emotions. It can stall our progress from healing and moving forward. And here's the clincher, that's why I've highlighted it, because self-pity keeps the focus on why things should be different rather than accepting the situation for what it is. So self-pity is a digging in of the heels in a sense and just getting stuck inwardly of, I hate this isn't right, why is it this way, why did this happen? So she goes on to say, sometimes self-pity is an act of defiance. It's almost as if we assume something will change if we dig in our heels and remind the universe that we deserve better. But that's not how the world works. There isn't a higher being, or a human being for that matter, who will swoop in and make sure we're dealt a fair hand in life. I mean, that's tough medicine, but that is truth, right? I remember when I read that for the first time, I just went, man, I needed to hear that. I don't like it, but I know I need to hear it. So self-pity, really destructive force. So the other thing that's important here is to know is that non-acceptance blocks the possibility of any adaptive coping, learning, or growth. And I want to give you an example here. I just need to grab maybe this bit of paper. Yeah. So what I want you to imagine is that this bit of paper is whatever you have been struggling to accept, whatever it is. All right? So you can imagine that in your own mind, whatever that is. When we're in non-acceptance, we're doing one or two things. We're either doing this, yeah, cannot, should not, must not, we're pushing it away, we're fighting against it, we're protesting. Where's all my energy going? Into the thing, right? And what I want you to imagine is as I'm doing that, that around me are things that I might learn, ways that I could learn to cope with this, ways that I could adapt around it, supports that are available to me. Imagine they're all around me, but I'm like this, fighting and struggling and pushing it away. Am I going to take advantage of any of that? I can't, right? My attention, energy, and resources are being sucked up into the protest and are not available to the ways that I might cope and adapt. That's one way we do non-acceptance. The other is more of a self-pitying, myopic focus, and it's like this. Why did this happen to me? I hate that this is happening. This isn't right. Why did this happen? I should have changed this, should have done that. Again, when I'm in that, I'm again not available to the ways that I could cope, adapt, learn, grow. So that's the problem, right? Now, acceptance is more like this, okay? We'd like to be able to just get rid of it, but we can't. It's there in our lives. But what we're doing is we're receiving, not like we like it or want it. We may not have wished it upon ourselves, but it's, okay, this is. And now we can start being free to start adapting, learning, growing. You see that difference? Right, that's what acceptance does. That's why it's so powerful. So to repeat on that, the attitude of acceptance stops the useless squandering of our attention, energy, and resources that occurs when we pick a fight with reality. It frees up our attention, energy, and resources so that they can be directed towards what we can learn and what we can control and change. And this enables us to be resilient and to constructively adapt and to learn what God is trying to teach us. Yeah. So to use a simple analogy again, getting stuck in bad traffic, all right? Nobody likes that. We don't want it. But there's two ways to go through bad traffic. One is non-acceptance. I hate this. Why isn't the government fixing the roads? Why is there all this road work? What's that idiot doing? You know, like just being in the protest. The other way to go through it is, okay, I don't like this, but it is what it is, all right? We settle ourselves down and accept, and then all of these options become available to us. Listen to a podcast, listen to music, practice some deep breathing, watch other people, laugh at them because they're losing it, play the number plate game where you make up, words for each letter. I mean, there's just all these options, right? And that is life. That is life. When we hit something that we don't like and we learn to accept it, options open up to us. So this brings us to my favourite piece of psychological and spiritual advice on the entire planet. The Serenity Prayer. I love it. I often say to people, if I had the opportunity to only teach one thing, like I had my one moment to teach one thing to people, it would be the Serenity Prayer, because in it is the wisdom of life. So it says, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Right? Now, you don't get to that third line that says the courage to change the things you can if you don't do line 2. Right? Because when we're not accepting, we're in the pushing away like this, and we do not get the courage to change the things we can. We don't even get to that. What we end up doing instead is something I penned a number of years ago called the Insanity Prayer. God grant me the turmoil to focus on, fight, resist, hate, and struggle with the things I cannot change, the fearfulness, laziness, resistance, or irresponsibility to shrink from changing the things I can, and the resignation to embrace the resulting misery. Always get laughter when I show that one, because we all know we've done that, right? That is the default human position, I think, to actually go that way. And it takes some growth and maturity and grace to often switch us to the Serenity Prayer. Go back. So I want to show you this last thing before we sort of take a turn. But this is one of my favourite quotes ever on acceptance. Like, if I'm working with a patient or a client who's struggling with acceptance, I'll often print this out, laminate it, give it to them, and say, I want you to read this every day, right, to get that in the mind. So it goes like this. This is how it is, not how it was, might have been, should have been. Not how I wanted it to be, hoped it would be, planned it would be. I accept that this is how it is. Now I get on with my life in a positive way. So I hope you can see that we don't get that last line, getting on with our life in a positive way, if we don't have the line before it. It's like the Serenity Prayer. You don't get to the courage to change the things you can unless you have the acceptance of the things you cannot change. That is good advice. And it's very validating as well, because things may not be the way we wanted them to be, or they're not the way they should have been. So there's sort of a recognition of that, and a holding of that sorrow or whatever it is, but also that realism of, but I have to accept if I need to move beyond this. Yeah? So we hit a point where hopefully I've at least mentally convinced you that acceptance is a really good thing to do. All right? So I've just written it here. Okay, I get it. I need to practice acceptance in my life, but I just can't seem to make myself get there. It's almost like there's some part of us that still wants to dig in the heels and go, no, whatever that thing is, why should I accept it? Right? So we find this struggle. And this used to puzzle me a lot, because I began teaching on acceptance, and some people would really get it and embrace it, but there was always this percentage of people that just would not go there. All right? And I was like, what is the problem? What's the block? And it finally dawned on me one day, and I realized, man, this operates in my life too. So I'm going to talk to you about the underlying block to acceptance. So there's a blocking force to acceptance that is rarely identified or addressed. None of us wants to admit it, and it's very challenging to face within ourselves. Any guesses as to what it is? Any?
The first way we sort of enjoy the thing that we find so reprehensible.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. It's not what I'm going to say, but I think there is truth in that. Yes, it's like part of us takes pleasure in resisting and maybe feeling that self-pity or whatever it is. Yeah, it's in a perverse way. It's bizarre, that, isn't it? But that can be true.
Maybe ego?
Yes, ego. I have a particular word for it, but it is. It's ego. And we're going to call it pride, right? And not the healthy kind, as in I'm proud of my kids or I'm proud of that achievement, right? It's equivalent to ego and willfulness. This is the realization that finally hit me. This is the problem, right? And so if I was to do a flow chart again, it works like this. Pride leads to non-acceptance, which then leads to self-pity and resentment and victim mentality. All right? I'm going to unpack this for you because this is heavy. All right? I reckon this is heavy. It's hard to face. So unhealthy pride represents what I call the clash of the mighty I or the mighty self with God's reality itself. All right? The clash of the mighty I. And notice what letter is right in the middle of pride? I. Just like it's the middle of sin as well. I. Very interesting. So when we're in unhealthy pride, we're operating, maybe not fully consciously, but we're operating out of this. This, whatever this is, does not fit with my vision of rightness and justice, my view of how the world should run, my view of how things should be turning out, my view of how God should treat me. Sorry, I'm struggling to read that again. My view of how God should treat me and what he should allow to happen in my life. And secretly, the subtext going on in our hearts is, I therefore stand in indignant or self-pity and condemnation of how things are. I'm standing in judgment of God's reality. All right? That is pride, elevating our viewpoint over and above God's reality itself. So unhealthy pride manifests as the over-attachment to the supposed rightness of my ideas, my beliefs, my expectations, and my needs. And it's elevating those aspects of self to the level of universal moral precepts that life and others, including God, just ought to respect and obey. Now, it's rare that we kind of see it like that, but that is actually what's going on a heart level. So unhealthy pride is a rigid but frequently unconscious attitude that I know how things should be. I know what I need and deserve. I know how others should and should not act. And if life, God, hands me something different to this, then life or God is wrong. And the subtext going on underneath that is if I was running the show and was in control, things would surely run a whole lot better. Confronting, but true. And it's interesting. I mean, I think amongst Christians, there's a deeper level of understanding of pride and so forth. But this even makes sense to people who are not Christians. I've presented this many times to people with no faith whatsoever, and they're still like, I can see I'm doing that. So there's some recognition that this is what's going on. I'll give you a biblical example of this. The Israelites, when they were being led out of Egypt into the Promised Land, all right? So they were told by Moses, who was speaking for God, that you're going to be led out of this awful captivity and you're going to go to a land flowing with milk and honey. It's going to be awesome, right? So they developed an expectation of what that would look like. And then they get delivered, they cross the Red Sea, and then they're in the desert. And they're like, what are we doing here? Are we lost? I thought we were going to the Promised Land. So they're faced with a massive reality gap. So their expectation or their vision was that God will lead us straight into the Promised Land, where we'll be successful, all our needs will be supplied, it'll be awesome. But their reality is that they were hot, hungry, and thirsty. And confused. Like, this just does not fit with how we expected it to go. All right? And I put myself in their shoes and I'm thinking, I would feel the same way, to be honest. I think most of us would. But the results of their clinging to their prideful non-acceptance, because that's what they ended up in, they could not accept what was going on, is that they fell into self-pity. The Bible calls that grumbling and complaining. They became very resentful towards Moses, Aaron, and ultimately God. And it led to disobedience. They had a powerful desire to return to Egypt. And what they were actually saying in that was, we'll take care of ourselves, thank you very much, because God is doing such a poor job. All right? So it was actually their pride that was blocking them. And I'm going to draw this out a little bit more. In asking the question, well, what was God actually trying to teach them through their mysterious journey in the desert? And the Word of God says this. He says, and you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you. There's something. Testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. There's another thing. And he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. So if we break that down, what he was trying to teach them, firstly, was humility, letting go of their prideful demands of how life should be and trusting God's higher purposes and ways. That's humility. He was trying to teach them trust and reliance, learning to fully rely on God's miraculous provision in impossible situations. And thirdly, he was trying to teach them obedience, refusing to rely on their own salvation plans, like going back to Egypt, and faithfully doing what God said and trusting him for good outcomes. That's what he was actually trying to teach them, right? But, I've written it in red, they could not open their hearts and minds to any of these things while they were in prideful non-acceptance. While they were protesting, right, and fighting and struggling because it did not fit their expectations, they could not open to what it was that God was trying to teach them. And this happens in our life all the time, by the way. I've had multiple experiences in my life where I'm so angry at God because things aren't going the way I think they should, that I'm not even open to listen to what he might be teaching. All right? I don't want to hear that. You just change it to fit my expectations. Right? This is the battle we get in pride. Now, I want to bring this really to life for you now through a character out of Forrest Gump. Who here's seen Forrest Gump? And most people have probably seen it. Great movie. And there's a character in it called Lieutenant Dan. And we're going to do a bit of a character study on Lieutenant Dan because I think it brings this alive beautifully. So just so you know, Lieutenant Dan basically came from a long line of military ancestry, and all of his ancestors had died gloriously in battle. And that was his vision. That's what's going to happen to me. So in the movie, he's like a lieutenant at the Vietnam War, and Forrest Gump comes under his sort of leadership. And during the war, they get into this firefight situation, and Lieutenant Dan gets blown up, thinks he's going to die, his destiny has been fulfilled, and then Forrest saves him and doesn't let him die. So his expectation of how things should go and his reality did not match. And what we're going to watch is how this unfolds for Lieutenant Dan, which I think is a dramatised version of what happens to us when we have reality gaps in our lives. You see it, huh? And it's totally understandable that there's grief, that there's sadness, that there's anger. Those emotions are all understandable in the context of something so life transforming when your life's going this way and suddenly it's going this way. But you're seeing the seeds of that non-acceptance, right? Of this is how it should be, and I can't let go of that. I can't accept how it is. And so we're going to watch how this continues to unfold, right? This is a dramatised kind of vision of what happens when we stay in non-acceptance. So, dramatising the self-pity and resentment. You see that? And angry at God, right? Ultimately at God, because God is the ultimate authority. So there's this sense of, what have you done to my life? Right? And we see the caustic resentment and the self-pitying kind of talk. There's a saying in the addiction field, which is, pour me another drink, which I think is good, which is he's trapped in. So yeah, we're seeing a really strong expression of it. Now the next scene is where it peaks and things begin to turn. So here we go. I love that. He was humbled. In the end, what we see here is humility. It's as if he finally opened to the possibility that something good can come out of something bad. That the awful, destructive storms of life can generate unexpected positives if we're humble and open-minded enough to perceive and receive them. It's like he suddenly realises, maybe I don't know what's best for me, always. Maybe my vision of how things should be is too small and limited by my finite human perspective. So what follows is that beautiful interaction where he thanks Forrest for saving his life, And in that, he's displaying acceptance of his unchosen reality for the first time. And then he jumps from the boat into the water and swims in that relaxed fashion that we see there. And it's almost like he's washing away the years of stuckness, self-pity, and resentment that was the result of his prideful non-acceptance. And what's so beautiful is, and this is what happens in our life, when we finally accept, then new possibilities open. So, like I said, new possibilities open when we can come to acceptance. Right? The new things that can happen. If he had not hit acceptance, he would not be living the life that he was living there. Right? You just don't get that. So when we look at what is the antidote to pride, which is the source of non-acceptance, we come to humility. So this is an attitude that acknowledges that I am not omniscient, I'm not all-knowing, I don't always know what's best for me, I have a lot to learn, and maybe there's a bigger picture playing out that I cannot perceive or understand right now while I'm in the midst of a massive reality gap. Humility says that it's not my job to stand in judgment of reality and pick an endless fight with what is. Rather, it's my job to accept the cards God has dealt me and to work responsibly with what I can control. And I only ever really get around to doing this when I stop pridefully wasting my time, attention, and energy fighting with and opposing what God has allowed in my life. So I love these pictures called mosaics because I think these demonstrate this really lovely, in a really lovely way. So a mosaic is like, they put them in movie posters. So this is one for Star Wars where you see like the rebellion with Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia and Han and all of that, those crew. And we know that they won the day. It ended up great. But that picture that you can see up there is actually made up of thousands of little scenes out of the movies. Right? Little mosaic pictures all combined together. So when you see it in the macro, it's this big picture. You go up close, it's all these little scenes. And this is our life. Right? Our life has a big picture that God is weaving, but we live it scene by scene. And in some of those scenes that make up that picture that you could see, the dark side is winning. Things are going terribly. It doesn't look like anything's going to work out. It's all bad, right? But in the big picture, there's something beautiful playing out. And that's the way it is with God in our lives as well, is he weaves on a canvas that is far more vast and big than we can possibly imagine. And humility says, I can't get stuck in a scene. Right? Even if it's a series of scenes, there's a bigger picture that God is telling. There's another wonderful story, and we're coming towards the end here. I know it's getting late. The couple of last important points. A story called I think it's the Chinese farmer. There it goes.
Once upon a time, there was a Chinese farmer who lost a horse, ran away. And all the neighbors came round that evening and said, that's too bad. And he said, maybe. The next day, the horse came back and brought 7 wild horses with it. And all the neighbors came around and said, why, that's great, isn't it? And he said, maybe. The next day, his son was attempting to tame one of these horses and was riding it and was thrown and broke his leg. And all the neighbors came round in the evening and said, well, that's too bad, isn't it? And the farmer said, maybe. And the next day, the conscription officers came around looking for people for the army, and they rejected his son because he had a broken leg. And all the neighbors came round at the evening and said, isn't that wonderful? And he said, maybe. The whole process of nature is an integrated process of immense complexity, and it is really impossible to tell whether anything that happens in it is good or bad, because you never know what will be the consequences of a misfortune, or you never know what will be the consequences of good fortune.
There it is. Now, that guy, Alan Watts, I don't approve of his teaching as a whole. Some of you may be familiar with him, very new agey guy. But you can't dispel the truth of that story. Yeah? And this quote, the whole process of nature is an integrated process. I'd say the whole process of God's plan that he is weaving is an integrated process of immense complexity, and it is really impossible to tell whether something that happens in it is good or bad, because you never know what will be the consequences of the misfortune, or you will never know what will be the consequences of the good fortune. Our perspective is too small. So in other words, we need to be humble to admit that we don't see the big picture, and thus we are woefully inept at accurately judging the rightness or wrongness of what God is allowing to arise in our experience at any point in time. And this is scriptural, right? This beautiful scripture in Isaiah 55, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. I was just thinking on this one, we'd have to admit that the difference between God and us is at least the size of the difference between us and a dog. Vastly more, actually. But we got a dog, Eddie, he's a golden retriever, and we do things with him that he must think, what the heck are you people doing? We come and we clip his nails and he hates it. Last night my wife was cleaning out his ears because he gets all this gunk in his ears, and he absolutely despises it and thinks that we're doing awful stuff. But behind it is actually love, care, right? But his finite understanding cannot understand our thoughts and ways. And the difference between us and a dog is like nothing compared to the difference between us and God. So God's ways are so much above ours. And this one here, which can come across as a cliche, but we have to decide at some point whether it's true or not. It says, we are sure to know that all things work together and are fitting into a plan for good, to and for those who love God and are called according to his design and purpose. So at some point, we need to accept that that's either true, right? That all things, including the bad stuff that we struggle to accept, is working into a plan for good, right? Or we step back in faith and into non-acceptance, out of faith and into non-acceptance, and go, no, I don't believe that. That is the challenge that's before us. So do we really want to take on God, is I guess what I'm saying, right? When we're in pride and we're not in humility, we're taking on God, and in the end, Jesus wins every time, right? So we might as well get on the winning team. Yeah, and I love these verses, the truth that they bring. It says, God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. And the Amplified Version brings it out even more. For God sets himself against the proud, and he opposes, frustrates, and defeats them. Think about that. When we're in pride and we're in non-acceptance, we are being actively opposed, frustrated, and defeated by God. But he gives grace, that is favor and blessing to the humble. So we can't beat God. And so the last word here actually comes from a really interesting source. It's the AA basic text. So Alcoholics Anonymous basic text. I love this quote. I'm certainly not putting it above Scripture. Scripture is vastly superior, but it's a really nice quote. It says, "And acceptance is the answer to all my problems today. When I am disturbed, it is because I find some person, place, thing, or situation, some fact of my life unacceptable to me. I can find no serenity until I accept that person, place, thing, or situation as being exactly the way it is supposed to be in this moment. Nothing, absolutely nothing happens in God's world by mistake. Unless I accept life completely on life's terms, I cannot be happy. I need to concentrate not so much on what needs to be changed in the world as on what needs to be changed in me and my attitudes." And there you have it. And so, as we finish up, do we have time? Or is it more maybe take it home and do it? Yeah. I do have an exercise that I would really love you to do. It's a series of questions, so we'll hand these out to you. Essentially, it gets you to describe something that perhaps you're struggling to accept, to reflect on the impact of non-acceptance on you and those around you, and then to look at what it might mean to accept it, what you could learn, and then what you could channel your attention, energy, and resources into actually changing. So really worthwhile exercise to do. It'll help you to consolidate and solidify what we've talked about tonight. So, as those are being handed around, how about we end in prayer? So, Lord, we thank you for the plan that you are weaving in each of our individual lives, that you are good, even when we struggle to see that. And Lord, even when things are going on in our lives that we so struggle to accept, you are still working all things for good. You're working out a plan in our lives that we can't fathom or see right now. Lord, I pray that you would send your Spirit to bring humility to our hearts, that you would cast down any pride and arrogance that stands in opposition to what you are up to in this world, and you would help us to humbly accept your purpose and plan for our lives, and in that, actually to be so much happier, so much more at peace, and so much better of a representative of you, Jesus Christ, when we are in that place. So, Lord, may your word go forth tonight, may it touch hearts, may it change hearts, and we thank you for all that's happened tonight in Jesus' name. Amen.